Warm dusk settles over the Mughal palace like a velvet sigh, drifting through carved yali screens and quiet marble courtyards, and a young prince stands beneath an open pavilion, pretending to study the fading sky while secretly listening for the soft footsteps of the poet whose verses have begun to unsettle his carefully groomed composure. He watches attendants extinguish lamps one by one, each flame bowing out like a performer leaving the stage. And though he knows heirs to empires not supposed to crave the company of poets, his thoughts keep circling the man whose words feel sharper than diplomacy and far more dangerous than any blade at court. Far below, the palace gardens breathe out the scent of jasmine and damp earth, and he imagines the poet there now, reciting lines to the night itself, unconcerned that those lines have already slipped beneath the prince's ribs, an intrusion he both resents and welcomes, which is emotionally inconvenient, to put it mildly. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, because forced loyalty has never worked well for emperors, princes, or anyone cornered in a court full of politely sharpened smiles. He imagines you listening from your own quiet corner of the world, and he nearly smiles at the thought, as if sharing this secret with someone beyond these palace walls makes it feel lighter somehow. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Because the prince is about to step into a garden where fate rustles through leaves like a patient storyteller waiting for him to notice the first twist. He moves through the colonnade, footsteps echoing softly across marble veined like frozen lightning, and though guards bow in perfect formation, he barely registers them, focusing instead on the faint thread of music floating from the poet's corner. Yes, music, because apparently one art wasn't enough to complicate the prince's life. A historical detail flickers through his mind. Mughal princes were often trained in poetry themselves, expected to understand beauty as deeply as strategy, and he wonders whether this destiny was always waiting, whether his tutors accidentally prepared him too well for the one man he was never supposed to admire. He turns into the lower garden, where lanterns glow like captured fireflies, and there he finds the poet seated beneath an arching neem tree, ink staining his fingertips as he murmurs lines too soft for servants, but perfectly aimed at the prince's unsteady heartbeat. The poet looks up, not startled, not deferential, merely aware, and offers a half-smile that somehow feels like an invitation and a warning woven together, the sort of expression that makes scholars still argue whether intimacy between princes and poets was condemned, ignored, or quietly tolerated, depending on whose ego was at stake. A quirky tidbit slips into his thoughts. Court poets sometimes hid metaphors inside descriptions of flowers to disguise confessions, and he wonders how many times he misinterpreted lines he thought were about monsoon clouds when they were probably screaming something much more personal. He steps closer, pretending to admire a carved fountain, though his pulse betrays him with every inch closed, and the poet senses it. Of course he does, tilting his head slightly as though adjusting to the prince's presence the way one tunes a string to the right tension. The air shifts, growing thick with unspoken syllables, and the prince realizes this is the first moment he's entered a space not as heir, commander, or future negotiator, but simply as a man standing before someone whose existence rearranges his thoughts with the efficiency of a seasoned court strategist. As they speak careful circling words, the poet's voice threads through the lantern light, steady and warm. And the prince understands he is already too close to retreat gracefully. This garden has become a threshold disguised in petals, and he has stepped past it without noticing. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, drums mark the changing watch, but here in the garden the only rhythm that matters is the quiet, shared pause between them, the sign that turns two breaths into a single dangerous possibility neither has the courage to name yet. Moonlight slips through the carved lattice windows of the palace like liquid silver, pooling in soft patterns across the mosaic floor as the prince walks the quiet corridor toward the poet's quarters, telling himself he is only returning a borrowed manuscript, even though his pulse loudly disagrees with that official explanation. He pauses at the threshold where delicate curtains sway in the warm night air, carrying hints of sandalwood and ink, and he listens to the poet humming a verse under his breath, a melody so soft it feels like it's searching for a place to settle inside, someone willing to hear it. When the poet notices him, there is no startled bow, only a calm recognition that unsettles the prince more than formal reverence ever could, because this man has mastered the art of meeting royalty as if approaching a friend, and that unassuming courage fits him far too well. They walk together through a small colonnade toward the lower courtyard, exchanging remarks that glide effortlessly between philosophy, monsoon patterns, and the absurdity of court etiquette, topics that should feel innocent, yet each word carries an undercurrent that turns the air warm enough to melt any well-practiced princely restraint. A soft breeze stirs the hems of their garments as they enter the moonlit garden, where the poet recites a newly written verse about longing disguised as weather, and the prince feels an almost comical panic realizing the line about restless nights is embarrassingly, uncomfortably relevant to his current emotional situation. He tries to steady himself by recalling a historical fact. Mughal poets often embedded coded affection within descriptions of nature, using the shifting seasons as metaphors for unspoken desire, and he wonders how many earlier princes pretended not to notice such metaphors while blushing behind their jewelled turbans. The poet leads him toward a shaded alcove thick with jasmine, their conversation lowering into a softer cadence that blurs the line between confidence and confession, and though no rule explicitly forbids a prince from seeking companionship in a poet, every instinct warns him that this path tilts toward danger. Historians still argue whether Mughal courts genuinely tolerated emotional bonds across social ranks or merely ignored them until jealousy interfered with politics, and the prince senses the truth leans toward the latter, because jealousy in royal households tends to bloom faster than any flower in this garden. As they settle beside a stone bench, the poet's sleeve brushes his, a small contact that lands like a spark flicked directly onto parchment, and he hopes, ridiculously, that the darkness hides the immediate undeniable warmth flaring up his throat and into his ears. A quirky tidbit surfaces in his memory. Palace attendants used to gossip that poets could read a person's heart simply by studying their breathing, and he prays this particular poet has never heard such nonsense, because his breathing at the moment is an absolute betrayal of royal composure. They discuss the prince's upcoming council duties, the weight of dynastic expectations, and the subtle art of appearing obedient while wanting something else entirely. And somewhere in that discussion the poet's voice softens, offering insight not as flattery but as understanding, which feels more dangerous than any seduction. The prince notices how the lantern light forms shifting halos around the poet's hair, highlighting strands the wind keeps rearranging, and he thinks briefly, foolishly, that this moment feels like the center of a story no chronicler would dare record honestly. He laughs once, quietly, when the poet teases him about always choosing the most diplomatic phrasing even in private, and the sound surprises them both, lingering in the air like a signature neither can erase now that it has been written. A distant flute echoes from the upper terrace, its notes rising like pale smoke, and the prince realizes the night has deepened without his noticing, time dissolving the way it does when the world narrows to a single presence, framed by moonlight and possibility. When they finally rise to return to the palace, their steps fall in near unison, and the prince senses that something unspoken has begun to take shape between them, not declared, not admitted, but impossible to deny, woven delicately into the very silence they share. Lanterns burn low along the palace colonnades as dawn approaches, their amber glow trembling against marble pillars, while the prince finds himself returning to the poet's side garden, drawn not by duty but by an ache he tries, poorly, to disguise as intellectual curiosity about new verses in progress. He arrives just in time to see the poet exchanging tense words with a courtier known for wearing too much perfume and carrying too little loyalty, a man whose smiles always resemble polished weapons, and the prince feels an instinctive tightening in his chest. He pretends is merely irritation. When the courtier bows to him, the gesture drips with syrupy politeness, hiding barbs sharpened by jealousy. Because anyone in the palace can sense when attention shifts and affection tilts, and this man has built his entire political strategy on detecting such shifts before they become dangerous to his ambitions. The poet steps back, posture calm but gaze guarded, and the prince senses he's interrupted something, an accusation disguised as concern, a threat masked in etiquette. And though the courtier excuses himself with a theatrical flourish, the lingering scent of saffron oil feels like a warning burnt into the air. As they walk deeper into the garden, the prince asks what was said, but the poet simply shakes his head, offering a smile that tries too hard to be reassuring, and the prince recognizes that particular smile, the one people wear when protecting someone they know outranks them in every possible way. A historical fact surfaces in the prince's memory. Mughal courts often operated like elaborate theatres, with love, rivalry and alliances woven into performances that lasted years, and he suddenly wonders whether the courtier's presence here marks the beginning of a subplot he is wholly unprepared to manage. They reach the reflecting pool, where moonlight shivers across ripples, and the poet recites a half-finished line about trust bending under weight, and the prince nearly stops breathing because the words feel both accidental and incredibly pointed, brushing the truth he's avoided naming for far too long. He tries to respond with something appropriately princely, measured, thoughtful, elegantly detached, but the words dissolve on his tongue, replaced instead by a quiet admission that he values the poet's company more than he meant to, a confession so soft the night absorbs it before echo can form. Historians still argue whether Mughal poetry encouraged subtle rebellion against rigid social structures or merely offered decorative escapism. But tonight the prince feels the answer, tilting dangerously toward rebellion, because one gentle verse has already altered the trajectory of his heart more forcefully than any imperial decree. The poet's expression softens, not with triumph, but with something quieter, deeper, a recognition that their connection is no longer hypothetical, no longer hidden behind metaphors of monsoon clouds and restless winds, but standing plainly between them like a lantern placed intentionally at the centre of the garden. A quirky memory surfaces. Palace gossips used to claim lovers' shadows grew closer before their hands ever dared, and as the prince glances down he notices exactly that. Their silhouettes overlapping along the flagstones, an observation he dismisses as superstition moments before his heartbeat contradicts him completely. They sit on the low marble ledge beside the pool, shoulders angled just enough to appear innocent should any wandering attendant pass by, yet not nearly far enough to quiet the tension threading the night, and each pause between their words feels charged with delicate possibility. The poet speaks of court politics with unusual caution, hinting that certain council members are seeking leverage anywhere they can find it, and the prince hears the unspoken message: affection is a vulnerability, and vulnerabilities in palaces become opportunities for those desperate to climb faster than their honour allows. He promises, quietly, almost fiercely, that no one will harm the poet while he still breathes, and the poet's startled inhale tells him he has said too much, revealed too much, but neither of them steps back from the moment now blooming dangerously between them. When dawn finally cracks across the horizon, washing the garden in pale gold, the prince knows with sinking certainty that their bond has crossed an invisible line. And while he does not regret it, he understands this. The palace will notice soon, because jealousy always wakes earlier than love. The palace awakens under a sky the colour of muted rosewater, but inside the prince's private chamber the air feels heavier than morning should allow, because an attendant has just delivered a sealed scroll marked with the emperor's sigil, an arrival that rarely brings comfort, especially when delivered before sunrise. He breaks the seal carefully, aware that anything written in his father's hand is both command and trap, and as he reads the elegant script, his stomach tightens. The emperor demands his presence at court immediately, citing concerning reports about inappropriate influences on princely judgment, a phrase sharp enough to draw blood without ever saying a name. The prince folds the letter too quickly, as if hiding the words might soften their impact. But the truth stands. The courtier from last night has already begun his campaign, twisting moonlit conversations into scandal, reshaping delicate moments into weapons, because ambition grows fastest when watered by jealousy. He walks toward the audience hall with a measured stride, rehearsing responses that balance obedience with dignity, though he knows neither quality protects a man who stands between powerful egos and their desire to control every corner of emotional terrain, royalty included. When the emperor addresses him, the tone is deceptively calm, almost gentle, asking whether rumours of unnecessary intimacy with a poetic member of the household bear merit, and the prince feels heat climb his neck because the phrasing disguises accusation beneath paternal concern, a tactic used expertly by rulers who prefer velvet traps over iron chains. The prince answers diplomatically, offering respect wrapped in ambiguity, yet the emperor's expression remains unreadable, carved into the stillness of someone accustomed to hearing lies and truth, delivered in the same polished sentences, and suspicion darkens his gaze like clouds gathering before monsoon rain. Historians still argue whether this emperor valued loyalty or obedience more, citing contradictory chronicles about his temperament. But in this moment the prince understands the answer intimately. Obedience keeps the court stable, and anyone who threatens that balance becomes collateral, regardless of their innocence. As he bows and steps back, he notices the courtier smirking behind a pillar, hands folded with false piety, and the prince realizes that the man has already moved the next piece in this unspoken game, ensuring the emperor's curiosity sharpens into targeted scrutiny. A quirky tidbit flutters through his mind that palace astrologers once warned certain stars intensified jealousy among rivals, and he almost laughs at the absurdity, because no constellation could rival the competitive cruelty of courtiers desperate for imperial favour. Later in the poet's chamber, he recounts the interrogation with forced composure, but the poet hears the tremor beneath his words and understands the danger instantly, stepping closer with a calm that steadies the prince even as fear threads tightly through the room's perfumed air. The poet reveals he received a mysterious note earlier, a torn scrap bearing only 3 words, "You are watched," and the prince feels a sudden protective heat surge through him, fierce enough to expose itself in the hard line his voice takes as he vows not to let harm come near. But the poet touches his arm lightly, grounding him, reminding him that reacting rashly will only confirm suspicion, and the prince hates how correct that is, because caution has never felt so suffocating, so much like being forced to hold his own beating heart behind locked teeth. They stand close, too close, in the hush of that chamber, the poet's breath warm with unsaid fears, and the prince wishes, briefly, painfully, that they lived in a world where honesty wasn't lethal, where affection didn't require strategy, where 2 men could exist without the palace turning love into leverage. Soft footsteps in the corridor snap the moment, pulling them apart as an attendant announces the emperor's request for the poet's presence tomorrow, a summons that makes the prince's blood run cold, because such invitations often precede decisions already carved in stone. As the attendant leaves, the prince meets the poet's gaze, and they both understand without speaking. Something has broken inside the palace, a hinge of fate snapping, and from this point forward, the choice is no longer whether they love, but whether they can protect that love from the empire closing in. They slip into the storm-soaked night through a side gate long forgotten by most of the palace, the prince guiding her, still believing her a male poet, down flooded stone steps, unaware that every flash of lightning illuminates the strain in her posture as she protects not only their escape, but the fragile secret of her true identity that has barely held beneath the tightening pressure of imperial suspicion. The monsoon wind lashes across the gardens, bending palms and scattering jasmine petals like frantic confetti, and as they cross the lower courtyard she nearly loses her footing, prompting the prince to steady her with a hand at her shoulder, a brief contact that startles them both. Him because her frame feels lighter, finer than he expects. Her because touch is the quickest way a disguise begins to fray. They reach the old manuscript vault, a chamber used centuries earlier to store astronomical charts, and the prince pulls a hidden lever described only in palace legends, opening a passage beneath cracked marble tiles. Historians still argue whether such escape routes truly existed or were poetic embellishments, yet here it yawns before them, proof that even empires built on ceremony keep secrets beneath their floors. Inside the passage, dripping with monsoon water, she adjusts the scarf that hides the curve of her throat, hoping he doesn't notice how the rain has softened her voice into something less convincingly masculine, a quirk that used to matter only in poetry recitals, but now feels like a fault line beneath every sentence she speaks. The prince lights a small oil lamp and murmurs that court gossip will explode by morning, explaining that the jealous courtier has already submitted accusations implying improper influence, and though the phrase infuriates him, it terrifies her. Because if the court digs deeper, they might discover far more dangerous truths than forbidden affection. They hurry through the passage until it opens near the elephant stables, where a drenched groom loyal to the prince waits with travel bundles. He glances briefly at her with an expression she cannot read, and for a dizzying moment she fears he sees through her disguise, but he merely bows low, muttering that the court's spies are already circling. Outside, the storm intensifies, thunder rolling across the sky like bronze drums from a festival she's not seen since childhood, and as she runs beside the prince, she remembers the stories her mother whispered. Women who wore men's robes to seek education, recognition, or safety. Stories dismissed as myths, yet she now lives their every consequence. When they reach the outer garden gate, the prince hesitates, looking back toward the palace lit by flickering torches, and he confesses in a low voice that he fears the emperor's next move more than any enemy army, because palace punishments arrive dressed as decorum, their cruelty hidden beneath silks and protocol. She answers carefully, aware that too much emotion might crack the persona she has worn for years, but her words soften despite herself, urging him forward, reminding him that survival now depends on leaving before the courtier's rumour becomes a weapon, and he notices her tone, gentle in a way he can't quite categorize, though the storm makes thinking difficult. Together they slip into the night beyond the palace walls, the storm swallowing their footprints as they ride toward the river ferry hidden in the reeds, and though neither says it aloud, both understand that something irreversible has begun. Not only the escape, not only the betrayal closing behind them, but the slow, unmistakable unravelling of the secret she can no longer keep intact much longer. They travel through the drenched countryside beneath clouds still swollen from the monsoon, the horses splashing through puddles that mirror fleeting shards of moonlight. And as the prince glances toward the poet riding beside him, he notices again that peculiar lightness in her movements, that careful way she keeps her cloak wrapped. Small details he once dismissed but now gather quietly in the corners of his mind. By dawn they reach a thicket of tamarind trees where the storm has loosened branches and scattered fruit like offerings on the forest floor, and while they rest, she turns away to wring water from her garments, unaware the prince watches her with a puzzled softness, sensing some subtle difference in how fabric clings to her frame, though he chastises himself for imagining things shaped by exhaustion and fear. A wandering shepherd offers directions to a caravan route rumoured to be safe, mentioning that imperial riders passed hours earlier, their banners hidden, which sends a sharp chill through both travellers. Historians still argue whether Mughal trackers truly moved with such speed during monsoon season. Yet, the prince trusts dread more than academic debate, urging their departure before the forest's silence becomes a trap. As they ride, she feels the tight binding beneath her tunic shift painfully against bruised ribs, wounds from pushing too hard during the escape, and every jolt reminds her how fragile her disguise has become, how one torn seam or accidental breath could unmask years of secrecy, and she prays the prince never hears the strain threading her voice. At midday they shelter beneath a crumbling watchtower from an empire 2 generations gone, its faded carvings depicting scholars, warriors, and mythic birds with wings spread across stone, and she cannot help smiling at the irony. The tower honours knowledge restricted mostly to men, even as she hides the truth that she mastered such knowledge only by becoming someone she was not. The prince shares their last figs and remarks, not unkindly, that her appetite seems unusually small for someone travelling so hard, a comment meant in simple observation, yet it startles her deeply because she has worked years to imitate the broader habits expected of men, habits now fraying under hunger, fatigue, and the closeness of the one person she cannot deceive forever. They continue toward the old caravan trail, passing villages half drowned by flooded rice fields, and every villager they encounter looks at them with a mixture of sympathy and caution, as though recognizing fugitives by the way they avoid eye contact. A quirky local belief claims monsoon winds reveal secrets by lifting cloaks, and she clutches hers tighter each time the breeze rises. The prince rides slightly ahead now, scanning every bend in the road, yet his thoughts drift repeatedly toward the poet behind him, toward the grace in her posture, the softness in her laughter, the strangely familiar rhythm in her choices, and he wonders, with a mix of confusion and awe, whether he has misunderstood far more than her poems. When evening settles over the hills, painting the landscape in muted gold, they find temporary refuge in an abandoned mango grove where water collects in stone basins, once used by travellers, and as she kneels to drink, he almost speaks the question blooming inside him, but caution, instinctive, protective, ties the words in a knot he cannot yet untangle. Night deepens, fireflies weaving soft trails of light around them, and though exhaustion tugs at her eyes, she remains awake. Knowing the prince's gaze lingers in moments he thinks she cannot see. The truth presses closer now, fragile as monsoon mist, and she fears that revelation will come not through danger or pursuit, but through the tenderness growing unbidden between them. They reach the old riverside pavilion just after sunrise, its domed roof half covered in vines, and its stone steps worn smooth by centuries of wandering poets, scholars, and lovers whose names have long dissolved into river mist. The prince studies the quiet structure with unexpected nostalgia, remembering childhood tales claiming this retreat once sheltered those fleeing court intrigue, with nothing but their wit and a single loyal companion. Inside, dust drifts in pale curtains through broken lattice work, and she feels the strange comfort of a place forgotten by the world, though the prince notices the careful way she avoids lifting heavy jars or adjusting saddlebags, gestures he once attributed to poetic delicacy, but now register as something different, softer, more concealed, and he wonders whether he has misread not only her manner but her entire presence. The river hums beside them, wide and slow as an exhaled breath, and while they gather firewood from fallen branches, a passing monk, one of the few caretakers who still patrol this ancient pavilion, remarks that the storm washed away tracks on the northern bank, a historical fact that eases the prince's tension yet increases hers, for erased tracks mean freedom, but also heightened scrutiny if the imperial riders suspect their disappearance unnatural. They share a simple meal of rice and dried lentils prepared on the clay stove, and as she eats she winces at the pressure of bindings beneath her tunic. The prince notices, worry tightening his brow, but he says nothing except to offer water, though historians still argue whether Mughal noblemen truly possess such gentleness, or whether later paintings embellished tenderness to soften royal reputations. When she thanks him, her voice cracks lightly, too lightly, and he turns toward her with a searching expression that almost undoes her, for the sound contains a femininity no training has fully erased. She looks away, pretending to cough, but the silence between them grows warmer, heavily threaded with the truth pressing closer to the surface. As afternoon filters through the pavilion's carved arches, He finds an old tapestry depicting a warrior and a scholar sharing a single shield against arrows raining from opposing armies, a quirky relic that once symbolized unity across ranks. He shows it to her with a gentle smile, and the metaphor lingers between them longer than either intended, echoing in the rhythm of their footsteps. Later, while she mends a torn corner of her cloak using a needle she keeps hidden in her belt, he watches the delicate precision of her hands, their shape, their elegance, details he once dismissed as artistic quirks, now unsettling him with an unfamiliar tenderness he has no language for, at least none permitted within palace walls. Evening settles in, the river darkening into a sheet of obsidian, and he sits beside her on the pavilion steps, the quiet between them stretching into something intimate, unspoken and alive. He nearly asks who she truly is, but loyalty to her safety, to the fragile bond growing between them, stops him from breaking whatever fragile peace they've created. The monk returns briefly to warn them that imperial riders were seen crossing a village upstream, advising they move before dawn and reminding them that fugitives rarely find sanctuary twice. His words ripple through her chest like stones dropped into still water, each one sinking into the fear that her secret might betray them before enemies do. Night closes around the pavilion, crickets weaving a soft tapestry of sound, and as she lies awake watching moonlight slip across the ceiling, she knows the moment of revelation is no longer a distant threat. It waits just beyond tomorrow's horizon, carried in the prince's lingering glances and in the fragile tremor of her own carefully guarded breath. They leave the riverside pavilion before dawn, following a narrow footpath that winds toward the foothills where old trade routes once carried silk, spices and secrets across the empire. And as the prince walks beside her, the questions he's held back for days press harder against his ribs, urging themselves towards speech he still fears might shatter whatever fragile bond has taken root between them. When they reach a steep incline slick with early dew, she slips suddenly, the world tilting as her cloak snags on a jut of stone, tearing open the seam that hides the tight binding beneath. She gasps in pain, and the prince catches her instinctively, only to freeze as his hands close, not on the expected angles of a man's frame, but on the unmistakably curved truth she has carried beneath her disguise. For a moment neither breathes, the hillside silent except for a distant bird announcing dawn, and she pulls back with trembling hands, trying to adjust the torn fabric, whispering fragmented apologies. Yet the prince gently covers her hands with his own, stopping the frantic motions, his expression filled not with betrayal or anger but with stunned understanding that rearranges every memory he holds of her. She confesses then, haltingly, quietly, that her father taught her letters forbidden to women, that she disguised herself to become the poet fate denied her, that she entered the palace believing she could survive unnoticed. Historians still argue whether women ever infiltrated Mughal courts disguised as men, but standing on this hill the prince knows history's silence means little beside the truth before him. He listens without interruption, feeling the enormity of her courage settle across him like sunlight breaking through monsoon clouds. And when she finishes speaking, he does not step away. Instead, he lifts her chin with a tenderness fierce in its clarity, telling her the disguise never defined her worth, only highlighted the strength she carried alone. But danger interrupts. Hoofbeats echo from the valley below, imperial riders sweeping the trail they left hours earlier, their presence confirming that discovery of her identity would mean punishment far crueler than exile. A quirky legend claims monsoon winds can hide fugitives, and though neither truly believes it, they follow a narrow ridge where gusts howl like guardians ushering them forward. Together they climb toward a high pass cloaked in swirling mist, the world narrowing to stone, wind, and the steady rhythm of their shared breath. And the prince realizes the fear he feels is no longer for his throne or reputation, but for her safety. This woman who risked everything to shape her own name in a world determined to erase it. When they emerge on the far side of the ridge, the valley below opens into a wide expanse of grassland dotted with small fishing huts, a place too remote for imperial patrols, too humble for court intrigue, and he knows with unmistakable certainty that this is where their lives pivot away from destiny and toward choice. They descend hand in hand, no disguise, no titles, only two souls stepping into a life neither expected, each step dissolving the last threads of the world that would have torn them apart, and though fear lingers at the edges of the horizon, it is softened by the steady glow of something stronger than survival alone. By the time they reach the first hut, the sun has fully risen, washing their path in gold, and she feels, perhaps for the first time, that her story no longer requires hidden ink or borrowed identity. And as he looks at her with a gaze unguarded by palace walls, she knows history may forget them, but love will remember. The night settles again, but much more softly now, as though the world itself exhales after carrying the weight of their journey for far too long. The coastline lies quiet beneath drifting threads of moonlight, and somewhere along that gentle stretch of sand stands a small hut where two exiles finally rest without fear, their breaths rising and falling in the slow rhythm of those who have learned the rare art of choosing peace over every expectation once carved into their names. The wind moves lightly through the reeds, brushing the door frame with a hush that feels almost protective, and inside a single lantern flickers, its glow warm, unsteady, yet deeply content as it spills across woven cloth, folded garments, and the quiet evidence of a life built not from duty but from deliberate tenderness. You can almost hear the soft clatter of a clay cup being set down, the small sigh of someone settling beneath a blanket still warm from the day's sun. And maybe that's the most remarkable part of their story, not the escape, not the danger, not even the love threaded through every choice they made, but the stillness they finally earned, a stillness shaped by two lives that refused to bend into the forms demanded of them. Here, at the edge of an empire that once threatened to swallow them whole, they discover a gentler vocabulary for living, shared silence, shared laughter, the soft brushing of hands when words feel too heavy. As the tide draws in and retreats again, unhurried, unbothered, the world around them drifts toward calm, and you might find yourself drifting with it, letting the story taper into something quiet, something steady, something safe. End of script. Wishing you a wonderful day ahead. May everything unfold kindly for you.